Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our presentation tonight. I am delighted and privileged to introduce our SHUL member, Anthony Melnikoff, who will be talking on the subject of domestic abuse under COVID-19. According to a recent survey by Jewish Women's Aid, taking domestic abuse in its widest context, roughly 1 in 4 women and a lesser number of men will suffer domestic abuse at some time in their lives. The outbreak of COVID-19 has seen the numbers soar into what has been described as a tsunami of such cases. Why and what can be done to help victims? Well, I'm so happy that Anthony Melnikoff, our member, has offered to share his expertise and thinking and experiences in this area. Anthony is a JP and retired 3 years ago as a presiding magistrate, chairing the bench in both criminal and family courts, where he received specialist training to chair domestic abuse cases, as well as sitting on appeals in the Crown Court. He remains co-editor of Family Matters, the journal of the Greater London Family Panel. Nowadays, he does regular voluntary work with domestic abuse victims, including a weekly drop-in centre known as One Stop Shop for victims run by Barnet Council, sadly now unable to function normally due to social distancing requirements. Anthony also gives regular talks and has written several articles on topics related to domestic abuse. It was via his voluntary work that he was invited by NHS England to join a project aimed at publicising the incidents of domestic abuse under COVID-19, with the aim both of informing the public and helping victims. And of course, also, Anthony is a treasure member of our SHUL. I always enjoy our discussions and learning together. And thank you so much, Anthony, for offering to share your wisdom with us this evening. And over to you now. I'm just going to unmute you.
Okay, I think I'm unmuted now, hopefully. Thank you for that introduction, Rabbi, and thank you to BT, who caused the internet to crash for about 5 hours this afternoon, which meant what a few grey hairs I have left have now gone even greyer. As the Rabbi said, I did serve as a magistrate for a number of years, and what I want to do today, the talk is about domestic abuse under COVID-19. I want to first of all say a few words about the nature and scope of domestic abuse. What's special about COVID-19 in relation to domestic abuse? Why so few cases actually are ever reported? Why an even smaller number ever result in a criminal conviction? I then want to discuss or lay before you a couple of actual cases I dealt with at court, which I think are relevant, and then the way forward. I anticipate that the talk probably is going to take about 25 minutes, which is about the average length of a rabbinic sermon, and the internet allowing, that is, and then hopefully leave some time for a question and answer session afterwards. So if we start with the nature and scope of domestic abuse, you notice I use the term abuse rather than domestic violence. And that's because it isn't just about the physical. I suppose we tend to think of domestic violence or domestic abuse as being a guy going to the pub on a Friday night, getting drunk, coming home and giving his wife a black eye. And that's still part of the story. But domestic abuse covers not just the physical side, but also, for example, emotional abuse, psychological, financial, sexual, and since 2013, coercive and controlling behaviour, which is really a sort of an area that encompasses the others, has become a distinct criminal offence. Any of you who are fans of Coronation Street will know that there's been an ongoing case, which is actually quite well done, on coercive and controlling behaviour, been going on for some time and still seems to be going on and never seems to come to an end. 4 or 5 years ago, the Archers had a similar case too. Now, one of the main differences between coercive controlling behaviour and physical, other than the fact that physical obviously leaves physical scars, is that whereas a physical abuse tends to be a series of discrete events, although often they are on a frequent basis, coercive controlling behaviour and the other ones I mentioned represent a pattern of behaviour. So not a specific event, but an ongoing pattern of behaviour. And the courts don't particularly like that. The criminal court in particular prefers to talk about specific events. Although recently there have been a few cases of coercive controlling behaviour appearing before the criminal courts. The family courts are different because there we're dealing with the safety of children, and there the burden of proof is much less. It's balance of probability rather than beyond reasonable doubt. Now, I would add that in the current bill that's going through Parliament, the domestic abuse bill, which has been going through Parliament for some years, because every time there's a general election or Parliament is prorogued or we have Brexit or a pandemic, that tends to fail and have to start again from the beginning. But I believe that forced marriage is going to be part of that bill, probably again under the heading of coercive controlling behaviour. And also, I believe FGM, female genital mutilation, is also going to be carried under the general umbrella of domestic abuse. Now, another thing to say is that, contrary to what is often popular belief, domestic abuse is not gender specific. People tend to think, and in fact, I've attended seminars and courses where the speakers got up and said, domestic abuse is an offence committed by a man against a woman. In fact, that is in the majority of cases, but in roughly a third of cases that go before the criminal court, they involve a female perpetrator and a male victim. There's also been a significant number of same-sex cases too, male on male, female on female. It also doesn't affect specifically any sociological section of society. I've had doctors, I've had accountants, teachers, bus drivers, shop workers, even the occasional rabbi, or perhaps not the occasional rabbi, appear in front of me in the domestic abuse court. A very well-known celebrity chef, I think some years ago, I think it was Clarissa Dixon Wright, spoke on the radio about her father, who was a very eminent heart specialist, used to come home from a hard day in the operating theatre and give her mother a black eye. So it's not confined to any section of society, nor is it confined to any sociological group or religious or ethnic group. The Jewish community is no worse in terms of domestic abuse cases, but it's also no better. And the rabbi mentioned JWA. I've actually done some voluntary work for them in the past. They will attest the number of cases in the Jewish community that they are having to deal with. And as I think the rabbi said, a survey by JWA of not just in the Jewish community, but across the whole population, found that roughly 1 in 4 of women and a lesser number of men during the course of their life will be victims of domestic abuse. So what we can be sure of is that within the Barnet community, there are people who are victims of domestic abuse. I don't know who they are, but they are definitely there and they definitely need help. Now, why is COVID-19 a special case? And as the rabbi said, it did actually see, he used the words a tsunami of cases. Well, when I was sitting on the bench, I don't know whether it's because that's the way the rotas always came out or whether I was just someone who couldn't say no. I found myself sitting very often on public holidays in the remand court, particularly Boxing Day was one of my must-do days. And on those particular occasions, we used to get tremendous spikes in cases. And 2 types of cases were the ones which predominated: domestic abuse and drink-related. And very often the two were actually very much related. And that's because people were locked together and couldn't escape, locked together physically or locked together metaphorically, but they couldn't actually escape. They were there for the duration. And that's when people get fed up with each other, and that's when violence actually happens. And on one Boxing Day, I can remember I was sitting at Hendon Magistrates Court when Hendon had, I think, 24 holding cells, and every cell was occupied by somebody who was waiting to appear in court. And the Serco vans were backed up in the car park with the people who couldn't fit into the actual cells. And that was on a public holiday, on a bank holiday. Now, taking COVID, I don't want to bombard you with facts and figures, but I'm going to read you a few quotes now. And remember that the original lockdown was on the 23rd of March. Well, 3 weeks later, on the 14th of April, and many people said not before time, the government issued a document called COVID-19 Support for Victims of Domestic Abuse. And in it they stated, and this was, I'm quoting directly from Priti Patel, the Home Secretary, the household isolation instruction as a result of coronavirus does not apply if you need to leave your home to escape domestic abuse. Now, many people ask the question, what if you can't escape? And what if you've got nowhere to go? And obviously those are very reasonable questions. Another week or so went by, and a statement from the Department of Health and Social Care. They issued a safeguarding document, and I'm quoting again now, aimed at professionals and organisations who are involved in supporting and safeguarding adults and children. The document went on to admit that emerging evidence from statutory and voluntary agencies across the UK has emphasised the increased risks of domestic abuse, with Refuge, that's one of the domestic abuse charities, reporting a 25% increase in calls and online requests since the lockdown began in March 2020. Another week later, the Home Affairs Select Committee issued a report calling, and again I'm quoting directly, for urgent action to protect victims and prevent perpetrators from exploiting the lockdown to increase abuse. And it went on to say, we are calling for new emergency funding for support services. And it went on, new ways for victims to access help through supermarkets and pharmacies, outreach visits to known vulnerable households, support for children, a new guarantee of safe housing for anyone needing to leave their home during lockdown because of abuse. It then finished, the emotional, physical and social scars from domestic abuse can last a lifetime. Then into June, and the independent newspaper reported that calls to the UK National Domestic Abuse Helpline were risen by 66%, and visits to its website by 950% since the start of the coronavirus lockdown. Frontline service providers told the Independent they were bracing for a surge in victims coming forward as the UK starts to ease restrictions. And then right to the end of July, the BBC reported more than 40,000 calls and contacts were made to National Domestic Abuse Helpline during the first 3 months of lockdown, mostly by women seeking help. New figures show. In June, calls and contacts were nearly 80% higher than usual, says the charity Refuge, which runs the helpline. And as restrictions ease, there's a surge in women seeking refuge places to escape their abusers. We've seen in the last couple of weeks an increase of 54% of women wanting to access emergency accommodation. Then finally in this section, into August, an extremely useful document issued. I don't always say good things about the government. On this occasion, I will. The government issued a document called Domestic Abuse, Get Help During the Coronavirus Outbreak. It encouraged people to find out how to get help if you or someone you know is a victim of domestic abuse. And I'm stressing here, you or someone you know is a victim. It contains a definition of domestic abuse, much of what I gave above, a list of signs to watch out for if you think you or somebody else is being abused. And I'll just finish on this bit for this section. These include being withdrawn or being isolated from family and friends, having bruises, burns or bite marks, having finances controlled or not being given enough food to pay bills, not being allowed to leave the house, stopped from going to college or work, having your internet or social media use monitored or someone else reading your text, emails or letters, being repeatedly belittled, put down or told you are worthless, being pressurized into sex, being told abuse is your fault or that you're overreacting. The document also contains a comprehensive list of organisations with phone numbers, websites, beginning with the National Domestic Abuse Helpline, but including also specific helplines for men, LGBT, ethnic religious minorities, so JWA are in there, children and older victims. I have sent a link of that to the rabbi and to Barnet Synagogue office with a strong recommendation that be made available, possibly through the synagogue website, so that anybody who wishes to can access them. And I will come back and mention that later on. Now, there is unfortunately a double whammy, which is just at the time when people need these services most, they are least available. And the rabbi mentioned the one-stop shop earlier on. I'm going to just say one or two words about that, both because it's a major local facility and because it's an example of the double whammy, where just when you need things, that they're not there in the way they should be. The one-stop shop, ever since, I think it was set up in 2015, right from then, every Thursday up until the time of the lockdown in Barnet House in Whetstone, the one-stop shop took place. It's run under the auspices of Barnet Social Services, but was set up originally with the aid of a grant from the Home Office. And what happens there is a number of professionals go there every week from different disciplines, from social services, from Barnet Housing Department, because they play a very important role in rehousing victims, from a number of charities, including Solace, Victim Support, Jewish Women's Aid are involved, several charities involved with ethnic and religious minorities. There were 2 or 3 pro bono solicitors who were always there. And myself, I've been there pretty much from day one. And my job is to advise people on court-related matters, both criminal and family court, terminology and court procedure. And I work very much in liaison with the solicitors and also advising often some of the other professionals. The clients coming off the street, they don't need a prior appointment. They get triaged when they come there to decide who they need to see, an individual or sometimes several individuals. Some people come back further occasions, some only come once, some are taken on as clients by solicitors or by the charities or sometimes by a combination. So it's very much in the forefront. It's very much a trailblazing organisation. Sadly, since the lockdown, it's not been able to function in its normal way because we can't get access to Barnet House and also social distancing. So now it operates as a phone service. It's still very useful, but the idea of a one-stop shop where we're all in the same place and we all interact, and sadly, that's not happening at the moment. Hopefully, it won't be too long before it does. So why do so few cases actually ever get reported, and why does an even smaller, a minority of them, ever result in a criminal conviction? And there have been many very learned tomes written and PhD theses and psychological and sociological reports on this particular phenomenon. But what I've done is I've jotted down a few ideas from my own court experience as to why don't people report these incidents. And research has shown that, and I'm going to focus on criminal court and physical, because they are the ones that actually reach court if they're going to reach there at all. And let's, for argument's sake, just say it's a male, a perpetrator, and a female victim. It just makes life a bit less complicated. On average, it takes roughly 38 separate incidents of violence before any event is actually reported. 38 separate incidents. So why is this? And I think there are a number of reasons. The first one is fear. And fear can take many aspects. So fear of losing one's home, one's family, one's status, one's income, one's friends, fear of loneliness, fear that things will actually be made worse if you report it, of retribution, fear of going to the police and they actually don't do anything, fear that you're going to be threatened as a result of it, the fear of not being believed, and maybe worst of all, the fear that it could actually go through to the trial and he gets off. And then he's told, you're not guilty. She was making it all up. And that is probably the greatest fear of all. Besides fear, there's also shame. People don't want to admit that they are victims of domestic abuse. It casts a slight on them. But also, they often will say, well, actually, I deserve it. If I was married to me, I'd also give me a black eye. I deserve it. Why should I be allowed to have a credit card or a bank account? I wouldn't know what to do. I wouldn't be able to control my money. I'd just fritter it away. And of course, I shouldn't be allowed to leave home. If I did, I'd get lost. I'd walk in the road and get run over. So it's actually justifying on the basis that they actually deserve everything that's coming to them. There are also cultural problems. And on numerous occasions, I've heard in front of me in court, well, in my culture, in my religion, it's normal for a man to chastise his wife physically or his children. It's normal for a man to tell his children or his wife what they have to do. It's normal for a man to decide who his daughter should marry. And the opposite of that is that on the other side of it, people are used to the fact that it is in fact his right, and therefore they have no right to complain if he's doing that. And therefore these cases don't actually get reported. But finally, and I think this is the one that I hear the most, he's actually promised he's not going to do it again. I still love him. He loves me. He apologized. He's turned over a new leaf. He only hits me when he's drunk. He only hits me when he's stressed. He knows better now. It's not going to happen again. Well, sometimes it doesn't happen again, and quite often it does. Well, why is it then that once we get to court, once these things are actually reported to the police, why does such a small proportion ever actually finish up with a criminal prosecution? And I think you need to look at the process that actually happens when people go to the police. So a woman, let's say, turns up at the police station, makes a statement. The police are then supposed to interview the alleged perpetrator. Now, whether they do or they don't, I can't say in every case. Some cases they don't. But they interview the alleged perpetrator, I should say, and they've got to make a decision on whether there is sufficient evidence to actually proceed. And often it's he said, she said, there's no actual physical evidence to go on. they've got to make a decision. Quite often they'll say they can't take it any further. They might, on the other hand, give the guy a warning or a caution and send him on his way. And sometimes that's enough. Sometimes that will actually help, but often it won't. So let's say the police decide there is actually a case to answer. It then goes to the Crown Prosecution Service. And their mark is there a realistic prospect of a successful prosecution? A realistic prospect of a successful prosecution. In other words, are they likely to win the case? And if they're not, they're probably not going to be very interested in taking it any further. But assuming they do, we then run up against another issue, which is overwhelmingly, a lot of people then go back to the police and say they wish to withdraw. They wish to withdraw the charges. Often that's because they say they've got back together, they love each other, they don't want to pursue this, it's going to ruin their relationship if they do. Or they may just say, I misremembered what I told you. He didn't punch me in the face. I actually fell over and hit my head on the corner of a coffee table. Either way, the CPS is not duty bound to follow their requests. The CPS will decide on the evidence whether they want to proceed. And I'm sure many of you can remember the recent and very sad case of Caroline Flack, the broadcaster who was charged with assaulting her male boyfriend, her partner. He wished to withdraw, the CPS said no, and she finished up by eventually taking her own life. But one of the things the CPS has to look at is that in many, many cases, those people who wish to withdraw are acting under the most extreme pressure. And often this came out at the one-stop shop, and I can well remember a particular woman who came to see me, and she said that she'd pressed charges, her husband or her ex was up for trial. His brothers had come round to the house. They threatened to burn the house down. They threatened to assault and hurt her children from a previous marriage. What should she do? And I think in that case, we went to housing and we had her rehoused in a place of safety, which happens quite often. But in many cases, particularly more recently, we've had people from ethnic and religious minorities. And I have to say that includes very much the Haredi Jewish community. Mostly women, but there have been some men too, who are in a similar situation, who say they're in tremendous pressure to withdraw, not just from the other side, but from their own family as well on occasion. They say that they're being told that they bring the family into shame, that they're threatened with being ostracized, with physical violence, threatened that they're going to lose their children, which obviously is a major factor. Sometimes they're offered bribes to actually withdraw the case. So they're put under tremendous pressure. Sometimes they have to be rehoused for their own safety. I would remind them, though, I do remind them that in many cases the law can actually help them. And when we come to the Q&A at the end, maybe we can, if people want to, we can discuss the idea of bail conditions. I don't talk about it now, but maybe later on that might be some, if you wish, a subject to follow. So let's assume we've actually got through this stage and we've been to the court and there's been a not guilty plea and it goes to trial, probably 2 or 3 months later, maybe slightly longer now with delays in court. It goes to trial. It's a not guilty plea. What was very frustrating for me as a magistrate specialising in domestic abuse was probably 70% of the cases in the criminal court collapsed on or for the day because the complainant in the case refused to give evidence. Either didn't turn up in court at all, so we were left without our main witness, or they turned up and refused to go in the witness box because they said, I told the CPS I wish to withdraw, I don't want to give evidence. Or they go in the witness box and they answer every question with, I don't remember, I don't remember, I don't remember. And so unless there's very strong corroborating evidence, the case is going to collapse. But even if we do get through and that the complainant does give evidence, the final barrier is that the prosecution have to prove beyond reasonable doubt that the offence was committed by the alleged perpetrator. The defence don't have to say anything. The prosecution have got to prove their case. And of course, that doesn't always happen. Having said that, I think in the majority of cases, not just because I was in charge, but in the majority of cases where we do actually go to trial and the complainant does give evidence, a guilty verdict was reached. And I want to also remind you that at the end of the day, it's not just about the court case, as important as that is. It's about removing the victim from a place of danger to a place of safety. And if nothing's achieved but that, then something has been achieved. I just want to give you a couple of cases that I dealt with in court, which I hope illustrate some of the things I've been saying. And the first one was about a woman who'd been assaulted by her husband, not for the first time. He had assaulted her on several previous occasions. He'd just come out of prison on license for a previous assault against his wife. He had 3 or 4 previous convictions for assaults against her. He had other convictions for assaults against previous partners and against people who weren't his partners, just random people. He was basically a thug. So he was out from prison on license, charged with assaulting his wife, pleaded not guilty, and she actually did come to court, went in the witness box and gave evidence. And the evidence was pretty damning. And at the end of hearing her testimony, his lawyer asked me whether she could spend a minute with her client. I knew what was going to happen. She then stood up and said her client wished to change his plea to guilty. That happened quite a lot, because what they do is they plead not guilty in the hope that the complainant won't turn up in court. When they do turn up in court and give evidence, they then change their plea. And this happened there. And they didn't really have a decision to make. It was straight back to prison. In the meantime, his wife had gone to the back of the court and sitting in the public gallery. And as he was about to be taken down, she called out from the back of the court, "I love you. I'll be waiting for you when you come back, when you come out." Now, I've told that story on numerous occasions to different groups, and where I'm with a live group, and I mean a group who's in the same room as me, you know what I mean. It often brings a gasp, but it shouldn't do, because this is actually quite normal. I wasn't at all fazed by her saying this. The other case I want to mention, though, is much closer to me. That was very, very early on in my career. It's one that's really stuck with me. And that, I'm sad to say, was in the Haredi community. And it involved a woman who, I'd say it was some years ago, but I can remember it quite well, in her late 40s, and probably 5 or 6 children. And she'd been married for probably getting on for 30 years. And she had endured abuse for the whole of that period. Abuse of every type. It was physical, it was psychological, it was emotional, it was sexual, every type of abuse you can imagine. And she would often be seen in the street with her arm in a sling, or her finger tied up, or a burn mark on her face. And the story was always the same. She was very clumsy. She was always walking into open doors and burning herself on ovens and cutting herself with bread knives. And it seems impossible to me that in a close-knit community, people didn't know what was going on. Her children certainly knew. They were living in the house. But I know 2 people who did know, because she had 2 very close female friends in whom she confided, and they knew everything. Eventually, one day she took such a bad beating. She finished up in A&E, and obviously alarm bells rang, the police were called, and that led to us being in court with a trial. A not guilty plea was entered. And so the trial was there, and she did actually give evidence. And on the day of the trial, first of all, the accused, the defence produced a whole ream of statements saying what a good character witness statements. A couple of them actually went in the witness box to give evidence. Others presented written statements. That the public gallery was full of his supporters, his fans, saying what a great guy he was. He was spent several hours a day studying the holy books. He was a great donor to charity. He was kind. He was considerate. He was learned. No beggar was ever turned away from his door. The defence repeated the fact that she was very clumsy, always falling downstairs and burning herself on ovens and walking into cupboard doors and so on. But it went further, and it said she actually was mentally ill, and she deliberately self-harmed in order to cause her husband harm. So he was only there because she actually did it to herself. And the 2 very close friends that I mentioned, neither of them actually agreed to give evidence in court. In fact, neither actually even turned up on the day of the trial to give evidence. So in the end, it was down to the overwhelming evidence given by the forensic medical examiner that her injuries must have been done by a third party. They could not have been accidental. They could not have been self-inflicted. They must have been given by a third party, but also evidence of past injuries that hadn't properly healed, fractures that hadn't properly healed, scar marks, and the conclusion that the multiplicity of these, and also the location of some of them, which is just impossible for it to have done it accidentally or self-imposed, pointed to the fact that she was had been a victim of physical abuse for some years behind. So the prosecution was able to prove their case on this occasion. But again, because the guy, we were only able to try him, or the court was only able to try him for one specific offence, which was assaulting her on that day. As far as the court was concerned, he was a man of previous good character. He had no previous convictions. We weren't allowed to try cases that may have happened in the past that had never been in front of the court. In the end, he got away with a suspended sentence and some community service. It was probably unpaid work in the community and so on. My abiding memory, though, is leaving the court afterwards, almost straight after the trial, and seeing him standing there with a group of his friends, laughing and joking and smoking. I just remember that they were all completely shrouded in cigarette smokes, but basically having a great time. I saw her leaving the court with her head down, completely alone, sort of slouched away. Basically, her life was over as she knew it. And it's one of these cases where the victim becomes the perpetrator and the perpetrator becomes the victim. And after this, I did make a point of speaking to some people from the Haredi community about this. And I got the usual response, yeah, it's terrible, it's awful, this shouldn't happen. But you know what? They shouldn't have taken it to the secular court. It should have been settled. We could have settled it. We could have dealt with it. Well, why didn't they, if that's the case? But I think things have improved. And I had noticed in recent times, both in court, but also in the voluntary work I do, a greater inclination for women particularly, but also men, from these minorities, and including the Jewish community, to be more ready to come forward, and perhaps to be liberated, to realize that they don't have to put up with this, that there is no compulsion. So if anything, that's a positive thing. So where do we go from here? How do we help victims? Now, in some cases, these things have a habit of sorting themselves out. Like the lady I mentioned before, finished up in A&E, and that's a very good source of help because it was now out of her hands, the police were involved and so on. GPs, now this is a difficult one because many people I know go to their GPs, they're confided in their GP, or their GP can actually spot that something's going on, but their GP is actually bound by patient confidentiality. And I've spoken to a couple of GPs on this, and I've not really got a straight answer as to what they would do. And if there are any GPs watching now, then maybe you could actually tell us what your take would be. But it's a very difficult area. But schools are a particularly good source. Children talk, they say what's going on. But also children show certain emotions when these things are going on. The effect of domestic abuse on children is one of my specialist areas. It's an area I've given numerous talks about, and maybe on another occasion here. The NSPCC actually issued a document recently listing of things to watch out for, particularly for schools. And it can be a change of behaviour. A child is particularly reserved, withdrawn, tearful, that their work is suffering, or perhaps off their food, or the opposite, they become unusually aggressive or disruptive. Doesn't mean there's domestic abuse, but these are all signs that there be. And often the schools investigate and social services get involved and the police can get involved and so on. And that's often a route. Pharmacists and shops are, one of the documents I read to you earlier, are being encouraged to take note of these things. Often it's friends and relatives. So often in the one-stop shop, I've had somebody come in and coming with a neighbour or coming with a cousin saying, look, I didn't want to be here, but my cousin said, or my neighbour said, I should just come and chat to you. And often that is a particular way. There's been quite a lot of publicity. Hold on. Something odd has happened on my screen here. You are sharing device. Yeah, I don't know why that's happened. Anyway, can you still hear me? Because something odd happened just now.
It's okay, we're back now.
Okay, how long were you off for?
You're fine, not long.
Okay. So I was talking about children, pharmacists and shops and conserved friends and neighbours. And there's been quite a lot of publicity. So, for example, the television had quite a campaign about getting people who are abused to actually tell people about it. Quite a lot of posters. So some of the supermarkets had posters up saying abuses in the home. Jewish Women's Aid had what they called the toilet door campaign. Some of you may know they posters that were put on the inside of toilets in synagogues. I mean, that obviously didn't work very well when the synagogues were locked down and nobody was going there. And that's unfortunately going to happen again from this week. In normal course of event, I would be advising the one-stop shop or people in the community, Jewish Women's Aid, and they're still available, obviously. But I mentioned earlier the document published by the government. I'm going to repeat this, that I think this is a very valuable document, and I would urge the powers that be in Barnet Synagogue to make this available on the website and to publicise it, because I think this is a very valuable document for those who are being abused and for those who are advising people who are being abused. Because really, at the end of the day, nobody deserves to live their life this way. Nobody should be made to live their life that way. And I think people who are being abused need to know that there are sympathetic people in the community willing to listen to them, and there are organisations that are willing and able and are there specifically to help them. Now, I would just want to finish this bit with a quote, and then perhaps we can move on to the Q&A. And the very first domestic abuse course I ever attended after I was appointed to the bench, and I always remember that the lecturer got up and said, one thing that's different about domestic abuse is that normally home is a place of sanctuary, a place of rest, of security. You've had a difficult day at the office, a difficult day at school. Your boss is giving you a hard time. Your clients are giving you a hard time. Maybe you're being bullied. You get home, you shut the front door, and you're home. You're safe. The problem with domestic abuse is that it's the opposite. It's when you go home and shut your front door, that's when your troubles really, really start. Anyway, that's what I wanted to say. So I'll hand back to the rabbi now and see if there are any questions or comments. Thanks. Okay.
Thank you so much, Tony, for that really informative and hard-hitting presentation. When Tony and I were discussing the format for the evening, we thought the best thing now is to be open up to everyone here for your questions and comments. And you know, Tony's got so much expertise. He's certainly happy to share that with you. But also, if there's anything you'd like some input from me on with either of my hats, then I'm also happy to field questions as well.
May I speak? Hi, hello everybody. Good evening. Good evening, Rabbi. Good evening, Anthony.
Hello.
Yes, thank you very much for that presentation. I just wanted to say that I was a senior housing professional in the neighbouring borough, managing a service for many years. And one aspect of the service that I managed was the antisocial behaviour service. And part of that was the domestic abuse element, because it's very, very important with tenancies and how you deal with that in the civil court and how you deal with that in relation to tenancy agreements. I just wanted to say on that I know you talked about rehousing people. It's not easy. It really isn't easy. And there is a lot of internal processes in terms of independent panels and how we work through that. And it's the same in any borough that I've worked with other social tenants. It can be done, but it's not easy. On that point, one thing that we often found is that the victims of domestic abuse themselves, they often weren't always that helpful. So you would work very, very hard to get somebody lined up with an offer of a tenancy, and then they'd reject it for sometimes the most daft reasons. I don't know if it was fear. I don't know if they were just scared of moving out of their environment, but it's something that I wanted to touch upon. So that basically that it's not, and the other thing is that one of the issues we have, that some victims would think that it was going to be a route to rehousing them to a better property, which it wasn't, because they could only have like for like. They couldn't have any advantage over the general waiting list or housing register people. And the other thing we didn't touch on was about, unfortunately, the women whose lives end because they're often murdered by somebody they know, and they've been the victim of abuse. So it's, unfortunately, it can be very sad. It isn't, you would see them in the courts, but we would always take the victim-centered approach and do everything we could to move them, because we didn't want them to be one of those statistics.
Okay.
And that's really what I've got to say on that.
Okay, can I come back on that, Rabbi? Thank you very much. Can I come back on that?
Sure, you're on, Tony.
Okay, on the housing, yes. One of the problems in the London Borough of Barnet is they're very short of housing, and so they've had to rehouse people, say, to Northampton or even further away. And often the victims will say, look, I've got 2 children or 3 children or 4 children who are at school in Barnet, and how's it going to work if we get rehoused to Northampton? So on the one hand, they need to be rehoused because they're in great danger. On the other hand, they've got to think of wider things like their children's education and things of that kind, or the fact that they might have a parent, or there was one lady who had a vulnerable child who was in a care home, and she didn't want to leave her. So I can see both sides, but so it is very difficult. On the question of obviously, sadly, some people do finish up dead. One of my colleagues, the solicitors I work with at the One Stop Shop, and I've got to be careful what I say because she might well be watching this, she's quite forthright, and often people who here in front of us will say, look, I don't want to really report it, I want to give him another chance. And she's often been known to say, well, okay, don't report him now, wait until you're dead and report him then. And it's quite a strong thing to say, but it's a very true thing to say as well, because that does happen, obviously.
It does
Rabbi.
happen. It's very sad when it does happen.
Yeah.
Rabbi?
Who's speaking?
Rabbi Tiver.
Hello, Ivor.
Tony.
Yes, hello, Ivor.
Thank you. Excellent presentation.
Thank
So
you.
a very simple question. Well, the question's simple. The answer, I'm sure, is not. You spoke about the case where you felt the only bit open to you was a suspended sentence.
Yeah.
Where does issuing a restraining order,
Yeah,
or an order that prohibits the perpetrator from being within such and such a distance, etc., where does that come on the scale of options available to you in the court?
okay. We might have made a restraining order. I don't honestly remember. It was a long time ago, and it's possible that we did. But yeah, quite often a restraining order will be made in these cases. Sadly, I did deal with one restraining order once. It wasn't domestic abuse, it was a neighbour dispute, and we did give a restraining order, and the next day it was all over the press. The guy had murdered his neighbour, stabbed to death in the street. So they don't always work. But yeah, I mean, it's quite common that the prosecution will apply for a restraining order to the court once a guilty verdict is reached. And it's quite possible it happened in this situation, but I don't know that it was actually necessary in this situation, but still, anyway, does that answer your question, Ivor?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. Yeah.
Hello. Hello.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi.
Can you all hear me?
I can hear you.
Hello there. Just 2 points. The first one is that I heard, which was very sad, that some women, when they're so desperate, they have all their identification, their passport, and anything that identifies them taken away by not just women. I mean, I'm sure the victim, and then they have to leave. They have to all they leave home with is the clothes or their children, or so they really have nothing. They can't. Then they're not able to claim any benefits, and that's how difficult. And I was quite shocked to hear that. And then I've got another point, because I work in the Crown Court at Wood Green.
Right, I used to sit there.
Yeah, I think I probably maybe met you there.
Yeah.
I'm an usher, but we have this new section 28. I don't know if you've heard of it, and it's when the vulnerable witnesses can come. They come and give their evidence before the actual case comes to court, and it gets recorded. So that then their evidence can be played in court, and they don't have to come back if it takes a long time for their case to come to court. They have given their evidence and cross-examination, and that is, I think that would be a very helpful way forward.
Okay. On that particular last point, yes, I used to do appeals at Wood Green Crown Court. I mean, there are provisions in the magistrates' courts as well for example, vulnerable witnesses giving evidence behind a screen, or we have done it by video link, although sometimes the technology does. I mean, we had the internet went down for 5 hours here today. That has been known to happen quite often when we're in court as well. But there are these provisions. But the other provision that exists in the criminal court, but sadly not in the family court, although there have been moves to change it, is that in the criminal court, a provision can be made that if a defendant is not represented, the court can appoint a solicitor specifically to cross-examine the complainant, so that the accused doesn't get the opportunity to cross-examine the alleged victim, and that's an important factor in trying to protect the victim. In the family court, unfortunately, that doesn't happen at the moment, and although it's been pressed for many years, it's still able, the alleged perpetrator is still able to cross-examine the alleged victim if within the family court, which I agree is wrong, and most people agree.
That will change as well.
I hope so. It's been proposed for many years. So far, it's not yet been enacted.
But
Thank you.
This new thing will not. They will be finished with. They won't have to actually come to court when the case is taking place.
Okay. Well, how can they be cross-examined? Is that going to be remotely?
No, it's done. They do it by video link. The counsel in the courtroom, and then that is actually played at the court hearing. That should help a lot of people, I think.
But how is the witness then going to be cross-examined?
They're cross-examined earlier on, before the trial is even come very early on in the matter. Okay. They're cross-examined by the counsel. Okay. For the hearing.
Okay.
It's all videoed and then played at the trial.
Oh, okay. Okay. Thank you. Right. Okay. Thanks. Any other questions? Hello? Anyone got any other questions? Rabbi?
Hello? Hello?
Yeah. Hello? Oh, Jan, hello. You're there.
Hello. Hello. Can you hear me?
I can. Jan's one of the solicitors I sit with at the One Stop Shop.
Good evening, Anthony. That was a very good talk. I really enjoyed that. I just want to add that with family courts, there's been a slight change with things, with the cross-examining of witnesses by the perpetrator, shall we say, alleged perpetrator. What they're doing now, I've noticed, is that they're not allowing them to cross-examine. They're asking the alleged perpetrator to write down what questions they want to ask and asking them to send that to the judge, and then the judge will look at those questions.
Okay, well, that's I was obviously ahead of time, because that's exactly what I used to do when I was sitting. I never let the alleged perpetrator cross-examine. I would ask them to write the questions down, and I would then put them in my own words. So I'm glad that they're following in my steps there. Yeah, I used to take out all the swear words and everything else.
Yes, so there has been, they're now adopting that with the family courts, which they weren't before. They were actually allowing the person to cross-examine the witness. It was absolutely terrible.
Well, you never sat in my court because I didn't allow that.
No.
You never appeared before me. Yeah, which is a shame. I'll be giving you a hard time.
You might know now also that hearings are by telephone, which makes it slightly easier for victims to talk and give evidence if they need to, because they're not actually looking at and they're not looking at each other in court. So there's been some, I shouldn't say advantages to the changes, but it's worked slightly better with COVID. This is all because of COVID.
Okay. Thanks, Jan, and I look forward to seeing you actually face to face for too long.
Yes, I know.
If not in court.
We've seen a lot of people together, haven't we?
We have, yeah. And I think you've learned a lot from me, and vice versa.
Yes, definitely. I learned a lot from you, Anthony.
Thanks.
Honestly, you gave an added dimension to everything at the One Stop Shop, definitely.
Thank you very much.
And it was it's very helpful when you are there.
Well, thanks. Thanks for tuning in.
No.
Any other questions? Rabbi?
Hello, Anthony. Oh, Marianne's got a question.
what support is offered to children? There's quite a lot of work being done, obviously, nationally around the long-lasting effect of trauma. Many domestic abuse situations are witnessed by children.
Right, yeah. I mean, one of the functions of the family court is to remove children from that sort of situation. It's a difficult one because it means taking children away from their parents, away from home. Do you know about CAFCAS? The Child and Family Support, and I can't even remember what it stands for, but Child and Family Court and Support Service, I think. I mean, basically, their task is to interview the children to find out and to recommend. Often they will recommend psychological services, or often it involves moving the children away from home into perhaps foster care. It's not an easy solution, but it's but the aim is to remove children from situations of danger. But the NSPCC are pretty good. I said they've issued a document which I have referred to about with the name of places that they can go and where children can be helped. Okay. Sorry, was there anything else? Okay. I mean, it's not a satisfactory answer, but as I said, one of the main areas of the family court is to remove children from that situation into places of safety. Okay.
Tony?
Suppose I just go on.
Hello, Ben, Vivian.
Firstly, it was really very interesting, your talk, and we do appreciate it when your time is spent. But I have a friend who was a GP, and as I would associate in Hendon, and she used to tell me about some of the, without mentioning names, of course, some of the problems amongst the Haredi community in Hendon, which are all kept hush-hush.
Yes, of course.
What goes on? From your statistics, whether there are a larger amount of Haredi people causing in your court from these problems, or was it just one out of the blue? And the same amount in the non.
I mean, the case I quoted was Haredi.
Yes.
I don't think, from what I've gathered from JWA, because I've done some voluntary work for JWA, I don't think the Haredi community are any more prone to domestic abuse or any less prone. I think it's fairly evenly spread across the community. I think one of the differences, and I know from JWA that they have field workers based, for example, in Stamford Hill. And an earlier one I know quit because she was threatened. She had her car damaged and so on. She was threatened with violence if she persisted. So I think perhaps they're more resistant to the involvement of outside agencies. Let's put it that way. More resistant to taking these matters to court than maybe other members of the community. But I don't know of any figures to suggest they are more prone or less prone than the rest of the community. But as I said, they perhaps are less inclined to actually bring it out into the public.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Right. Anything else?
Yes.
Norma.
What about women?
Sorry, Rena.
Yes. What about women who, to outside people who are their friends, their family, are very obviously subjected to coercive control, but aren't aware of it themselves, because they're so used to this way of life, if you like, that they aren't actually conscious of the fact that what they're going through is coercive control. And how does one get to these women and get them to understand that, yes, they're not happy, but it's actually, they have a way out if they dare to, but they're not actually conscious that what they are living is their partner, whoever it is, actually is committing a criminal offence.
Well, interesting, because the document which I mentioned, which is the one I want the Shaw to put on its website, actually uses the term sign to watch out for if you think you or somebody else is being abused. Now, this is something obviously that needs discretion, because what you said is you're noticing somebody who is being abused, but they're not aware of it. I don't know. I mean, the rabbi's a psychologist. Maybe he's more qualified to speak about this than I am. But how do you tell somebody, look, you are being abused, even though you know they are? I'm not sure I'm qualified to answer that question. But certainly the document does raise that possibility. And I highlighted this or somebody else is being abused, not just if you are being abused. I don't know whether the rabbi could actually throw any light on what's a very important question.
I mean, it is a very important question. We also come into sort of legislation at that point, because we've got things like mental capacity, which is an act which tries to determine whether a vulnerable individual has the capacity to make decisions. And sometimes people's decisions are a decision that we would not agree with, but nevertheless they have the right to make decisions that are their own. And capacity is something that can fluctuate, and capacity is something that could be dependent on a decision by decision basis. So, for example, thinking about, say, an older adult who has a fluctuating mental state as a result of dementia or early dementia. So one day they might be able to decide how to spend their money that day, but on the next day they might not have the capacity to know how to make a decision. Now, even when they know how they have the capacity how to spend their money, we might think that their hobby of playing with toy trains is a waste of their money and a waste of their pension, but that's their choice, and even if that means they're not going to have as much food that month, that's their choice. So there's an interesting sort of interplay here where the law can get involved, but only if there is only if there's a safeguarding issue whereby we feel that there is a lack of capacity such that a vulnerable individual needs protecting, or whether there is a broader case for protecting other people. So therefore, even if there's capacity, if for example young people are involved, so then there's a legal precedent to step in. It's something which is a tricky topic. We've been touching upon different societies and different communities' sort of responses to it. There's an interesting Gemara. There's an interesting passage in the Talmud, in the Tractate Kiddushin, which talks about the power differential that used to exist in society between men and women, such that it used to be the case that Tavla Mativ Tandum and Mativ Armalu, that a woman might prefer to be married than to be alone. And that was in a society whereby women were protected, in a patriarchal society where women were protected by being in a home, and that actually by being outside of a home, that they had less of a position in society, less of a status, and less ability to take a role that they wanted to take. So now some of those vestiges of patriarchal society don't just continue, say, in more traditional societies such as a black and white society. They exist in all sorts of different societies. There's even within contemporary secular society there's a gender pay gap, there's inequalities, and so it might be that a lady might make what she feels is a rational choice, and she has capacity to make a rational choice to stay in a relationship where she feels coerced, but nevertheless feels a greater level of protectionism and holding in that context. Now that sounds horrible for a person living in the 21st century to hear that, but it's just a sad reality of the fact that there are inequalities between genders, and they are what they are, and people kind of make the best of a bad situation. And it's very difficult to make these situations are just they're horrible. So there was a question earlier about children, and Tony was talking about the role of the court is to take the children into care. And Marianne asked about the role of what was going to happen of children in care, and there are some good stories about people who go through the care system and come out okay, but there's also sort of enduring stories of young people who go through the care system, and it's a horrible experience. And having worked in looked after children and adopted children's services, there aren't great answers here. So I think it's a really complex situation, a really difficult one to manage, when a person can consent to abuse, essentially consent to being hurt by someone else, or when they've lost their ability to consent to that, when they no longer have a capacity. So that's not a very clear answer, Rena. I apologize, but because determining capacity is a tricky one. So normally it wouldn't just necessarily be a single individual who would be determining capacity, but there are second opinions, and there are teams that hold those questions together. And I think one of maybe a couple of the things just to say in terms of some concluding thoughts from me is that risk should never be held alone. So if you're worried about someone, don't worry alone. Never worry alone. So if you might suspect that someone has coercive behaviour or is the subject of abuse, don't leave that worry. Don't leave it. Discuss it with someone, a trusted friend, a GP, a rabbi, if you feel comfortable, a psychologist, whatever. So discuss it with someone and get some more perspective on it, because risk should never be held alone. It's a very precarious and a situation to be holding risk by oneself. But also, if just a very pointed comment, if anyone coming out of this presentation feels that they'd like to discuss a case in absolute confidentiality, so then I'm sure Tony was happy to discuss any cases in absolute confidentiality, as am I. So and you can contact us, and it will be, and it doesn't have to go any further from just simply a conversation, and that's fine. If there are no other questions, we've got to an hour, and I think that's always a great sort of landmark for a Zoom session before we start losing people. So I want on behalf of everybody unless Tony, did you have any more comments to add from what I just said?
Can I just make one point? Can I just remind the Shaw, please, to make sure that document, that government document, is made available for anybody who needs it, and it's publicised. And once the one-stop shop goes back into proper mode, I will let you know, because that is where I would send people as a first approx if they do want to discuss anything.
Yeah, that's absolutely right, Tony. We'll do that. What we'll do is we'll ask our office to put it into Shabbaton this week with a link to the video, and then anyone who wants to replay the video and wants to access that link can do so. So that's what we'll do. And I just want to then conclude by thanking you, Tony, for raising this really important issue, and actually for persisting to make sure that it happened, that we would be able to share your wisdom and experience with the rest of the community. And now that it's on YouTube, so then anyone who wants to access it in the future will be able to access it, and we'll put that link around. It's for people like you, Tony, that communities come together, because community is not just about when things go right, it's also about looking after each other when things go wrong. And so we need education sessions like this so that we can all hold each other and make sure that everyone is as safe and is as well as they can possibly be. So thank you very much, everyone, for logging on. Thank you, Tony. Thank you. Everyone should stay safe and be well. Good evening.
Could see Glenn and Vivian.